Unrealistic one-size-fits-all approach. Panagaria criticized the uniform approach at the WTO, but he ignores that the Doha Agenda itself imposed rules that not match the capacity of developing countries. Country example, Liberia with a GDP of $3.2 billion in 2020 was unable to meet WTO sanitary standard for fish export, thus losing European Union market access. Cons: without financial and technical support, WTO rules widen the capacity gap between developed and developing countries.
Unilateral liberalization harms developing countries. Panagaria argues that developing countries should open their markets despite protectionist developed countries. However, unilateral liberalization often damages domestic countries' industries. Evidence: a World Bank study in 2005 shows that trade liberalization in Haiti in the 1980s to the 90s destroyed local rice production. Import of cheap rice from the USA increased by 150% while 30% of Haitian farmers lost their livelihood. For the example country, Argentina experienced post-market liberalization deindustrialization in the 90s. The employment rate rose from the 6% in the 1991 to 21.5% in the 2002, and poverty jumped from the 27% to 57% of the population. In cons, without selective protection policy, developing countries are vulnerable to a race to the bottom, where local industries are unable to compete with cheap import products.
The dominance of development countries interested in the WTO. Panagaria claims the WTO is the best friend of poor countries, but the structure of WTO negotiations tends to be unequal. Countries example is India and South Africa had to be lobby for TRIPS exemption during the COVID-19 pandemics to independently produce vaccine, but in the US and EU refused until 2021. The cons is the WTO is dominated by development countries that use political power to impose rules in their favor, such as TRIPS and the removal of exporting subsidies for developing countries.
Doha failure to address tariff peaks. Panagaria said Doha aimed to remove high tariff on labor-intensive goods. However, these tariffs are still in place. A country example is Bangladesh, the world's second largest garment exporter, lose $6 billion per year due to tariff and quotas in developed countries. Yet, 80% of Bangladeshi garment workers are low-income women. Cons: promise to tariff elimination in Doha did not materialize, and developing countries continue to face non-tariff barriers such as expensive quality standards that limit their export.
So, the author's fundamental ideas are: 1. Development remains a core component of the Doha Agenda, even though many countries are disappointed with the outcomes. 2. World Trade Organization's negotiations are indeed complex and full of compromise, but the initial intent still reflected the interests of developing countries. 3. The main challenge does not lie in a lack of attention to development, but rather in conflict interest, a uniform global approach, and limited capacity in developing countries. 4. Many development issues also include transparency, government procurement, and export-import informations, which are crucial for developing nations. 5. Developing countries demand to elimination of discriminatory trade barriers as a step towards a fair global trading system. 6. And the last, inequality in resources and implementation capacity makes it difficult for developing countries to fulfill the obligation proposed by developed nations.
Imbalance in policy implementation. Panagarya states that the Doha Agenda exports includes the elimination of agriculture subsidies and high tariffs in developed countries. However, in practice, developed countries such as the US and the EU still maintain large agricultural subsidies. For the country example, these cotton farmers in Burkina Faso and Mali were first out of the business because they could not compete with US subsidies cotton. According to Oxfam, the removal of US cotton subsidies alone will increase West African farmers' income by 1-2% of their GDP.